As the pandemic was beginning in early 2020, my wife and I were working on memorizing the Sermon on the Mount. And as I was beginning to meditate on just the first few verses of the sermon, something struck me that had never stood out to me before, and that is this. I've always imagined the Sermon on the Mount being preached to a crowd of thousands. But I believe that actually the Sermon on the Mount was preached to the 12 disciples. If you look at the beginning of Matthew chapter 5, the text tells us that when Jesus saw the crowds, his disciples came to him, and then he began to teach them, saying, and then he begins the sermon. And so this really framed the way that I was thinking about the Sermon on the Mount in a fresh way. Instead of being a sermon to thousands of people, this is really a sermon to 12. Now think about that for a moment. If we have anything that looks like a sermon to Christian leaders in the Bible, it's the Sermon on the Mount. These are the most important words that Jesus would communicate in the most important sermon ever preached to the 12 men who would lead the early church. And so as I began to think about the sermon in that way, I began to think of how Jesus is equipping the 12 disciples to lead the church through this sermon. What's interesting is in the Sermon on the Mount, it's interesting to me what's not there. Jesus does not teach them how to preach sermons that will attract thousands of people. There's actually very little leadership advice. And Jesus doesn't teach them how to organize the church. But what Jesus does focus on are things like how to forgive, how to love your enemy, how to pray. And he begins the sermon with 8 attitudes, 8 postures of kingdom citizens. And I think that the Beatitudes and the Sermon on the Mount in general, but specifically the Beatitudes, actually provide a roadmap for what it looks like to exhibit the character of Christ as pastors. If you want to shepherd like Jesus, if you want to live in a way that reflects the image and the character of Christ, you actually get to see the image and character of Christ on display in the Sermon on the Mount, and specifically the Beatitudes. Now think about all the ways that pastors are described these days. We are influencers and change agents and motivators, and we are visioneers and thought leaders and gurus, and we spend a lot of time thinking about leveraging our platform and expanding our brand. There's a lot of this in kind of our American church culture. But that's not what Jesus talks about at all. What Jesus focuses in on is a set of 8 characteristics that should mark followers of his, but particularly Christian leaders. Pastors should be those who are characterized by a poverty in spirit. They should be characterized as men who are broken over their sin, men who are humbled by God, men who are hungry and thirsty for the righteousness that only Christ can produce in us. Not toxic leaders, but men of mercy, people who are pure in heart, in motive and in action, men who are peacemakers, and men who are willing to undergo persecution and endure in faith in the road of ministry. And so the Sermon on the Mount and the Beatitudes in particular have incredible relevance to our pastoral ministry. It provides a roadmap, a way of thinking about pastoral life, pastoral work, pastoral character.